All right, here we go. What's everybody up to? How's it going? So I'll give it a couple minutes until folks find their way in here, and then I'm going to kind of explain how this works. It's going to be very similar to what we did when I ranked the U.S. presidents, though this is a little bit more complicated because of the portraits, and it entirely depends on who they included. Now, I recognize most of these portraits, and this one actually goes back from before 1066. I'm going to start right here with William the Conqueror when we get started. And I will definitely ask you guys for your input. So a couple of things as we start. Number one, when I do these topical streams like this, please keep your topics and your questions on topic. I'm also going to enable a 30-second slow mode on the chat, which means if you type a message, you won't be able to type another one for 30 seconds. That should help a little bit with spam issues and things like that. How's it going, everybody? So keep things on topic. Please don't ask me about Henry VIII when we're talking about Henry II. So try to keep to who we're talking about, the time period we're talking about. So understand that I just probably won't even respond to things that are off topic. So Bauman, hello from Hanover. Very cool. Interesting connection to the British monarchy when we get to that point. So I am going to rank everybody starting with William the Conqueror all the way up through Elizabeth II. And I will talk a little bit about these, each one as best I can. And I'll probably rely on you guys to help me on ones where I'm kind of wavering. We're going to go with S, A, B, C, D, F, and inconclusive. So inconclusive would be, for example, for someone, you know, like Edward VIII, who really just wasn't there long enough to have any kind of an impact on things, that kind of stuff. So, and these are just my opinion, nobody else's. So, you know, everybody's welcome to have their own opinion about this stuff. And obviously, I'm viewing all of this through my 21st century American eyes, and my own understanding that obviously might be very different than other people. We are skipping the Anglo-Saxon monarchs, not because they don't matter, not because they aren't incredibly important, but just because I had to pick somewhere to start, and I just decided to start here instead of going all the way back to the first king of England. So just a couple of things before we start. The second longest reigning British monarch would probably be Victoria, probably followed by George the Third and Edward the Third, I would guess. So Henry V should be D, Jack says. So we'll get there. Thank you in advance, by the way, as we are probably going to hit 96,000 subscribers while I'm on this stream, if not shortly after. Probably going to hit 100K Monday or Tuesday. I'm hoping to do a live stream. I have no idea what it'll be about. Just kind of something fun to do. I'm hoping to be live streaming when we hit 100K. It's going to depend on when it happens. Could happen in the middle of the night. So I don't know. All right. So welcome, everybody. I'm glad you're here. We are going to start with William the Conqueror. Here's the way I'm going to judge these monarchs. It's not on strictly on were they influential. It's did they have a positive or negative impact on the country that they were having they were reigning over or ruling over. Alfred the Great, I love him, but we're not talking about him. So that makes William the Conqueror a difficult one to judge, just because he completely changed the nature of the nation. So he's going to be one of the toughest ones for me. So I'd be curious to hear, how you guys would rate William the Conqueror. This is going to be probably one of the more controversial ones that I do, because you could argue that he had an incredibly negative impact on the Anglo-Saxon England, but he also completely transformed the country. Definitely very influential, but is it a positive thing? Yeah, the Doomsday Book, very important. I think some of the things that William the Conqueror did are very important. He set them up for the next couple of 100 years, obviously building all the castles everywhere, but he also devastated large parts of the country in the process. So Yes, the first English king is Athelstan. Alfred was not king of England; he was king of Wessex. Most British people you've spoken to said he's a great conqueror, but a terrible king. That's an interesting way to look at it. Um, so, yeah, it's a tricky one. I'm going to put William, I'm not going to put him in S tier, but I think I will put him in A, because it's hard to ignore, that England would not be, and Britain would not be the place that it is today without William the Conqueror. Not necessarily all positive, but that's one I would be fine with any argument that people made about William the Conqueror. So then that takes us on to, and I want to, I'm trying to organize some things here because I want to make sure I get these portraits right. I know the order of the English monarchs, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, like, for example, some of these portraits are a little tricky that they chose to use. And I'm gonna set up I'm trying to organize my chat view and things like that. So don't mind me as you see things happening on the screen here for a second. Okay, here we go. Didn't William's stomach burst for his funeral? Yes, it did. They tried to stuff him down in. He's buried in France, and they tried to stuff him down in, and it burst, and the smell was just absolutely ridiculously awful. And Ollie, yes, the harrowing of the North is what I'm thinking about as far as one of the things that I would definitely bring him down a peg or two for. William Rufus, yeah, his cheeks were red. He was killed in hunting, so it said. So William Rufus is right here. Not a good king. Not a good king at all. Queen Victoria rated H for hemophilia. Oh boy. So I wouldn't put William Rufus in F unless, I mean, I'd love to hear what you guys think. We're talking about William Rufus here, William II. He's king for 13 years, 1087 to about 1100. He may have been murdered. I think you could probably make an argument that was the case. And so that's who we're talking about here. He's going to be ranked low for me, but I would love to hear your arguments about how low. I'm torn between D and F on William Rufus. I'm kind of leaning D, but I'm willing to be convinced otherwise. Michael, Mikael, I don't know if there's a great way to memorize them. I'm sure that in England they have some way of doing it. But yeah, let me know what you guys think about this one. Seems like most folks are saying D so far. I'm pretty content with calling it a D for William Rufus. William II, if you will. Yeah, we'll go D. Seems like everybody kind of agrees with me on that one. Hunting accident, Cersei smirking from a corner. Yeah. You can't argue, Steve, I don't know if you can say someone who was king for 13 years could be inconclusive, really. So, inconclusive to me is someone whose reign was so short to as not had an opportunity to really do much. So now we're on to Henry I, Henry Beauclerc, as he's known. Now he's king for 35 years. So this is one who obviously has a long reign. He's actually the fourth son of William I. So he's there for a long time. Very influential when it comes to the laws of England. So he ends up dying of food poisoning. So that's another one of those kind of questionable things that's happening. But what really was devastating early in Henry's reign was the White Ship disaster, which killed his son and heir and really kind of hurdles England toward its first civil war post William the Conqueror. But I'm willing to go solid B, I think, on Henry I. I could see arguments for maybe even putting him A minus. Yeah, that's probably fair. I think I'm going to go B, Henry I. Did some really good things. I think he was a solid ruler. I don't know that he did anything particularly negative that could be criticized in any strong way. I'm still trying to organize my thoughts here a little bit because I've got some lists up to kind of help me think about how I want to do this as we go along. Yeah, there's a lot of ongoing fights going on between siblings all throughout these early rulers especially. Yeah, we're going to get to Stephen here in just a minute. So Henry dies, and his daughter Matilda, who I don't even see here, so I guess we're not going to really include her, but she's incredibly important because it's through her that you get the Plantagenets. But so we're on to Stephen. So Stephen is a pretty weak king. There's civil war. He ends up having to be basically his line gets disinherited. Oh yeah, you're like my desktop background's pretty crazy. All the things going on there. Hey, Michael in New York, how's it going? So what do you guys think about Stephen? I'm leaning DF on Stephen, but he might be our first F that we get. Also, if you look at his image, it's pretty, like, dude looks cross-eyed or something. I don't know what's going on there. Yeah, it does. They do have Cromwell in there. We're going to skip him for the purposes of what we're doing. But yeah, I do see Cromwell right there. And it looks like his son, too. So Stephen's going to be our first F, I think. I don't think you can say inconclusive about Stephen. He was king for 19 years. Yes, I'll rank the emperors of Britannia from my Crusader Kings 3 campaign. Seems like most people are with me on the F. Chappie, thank you. Good evening to you. I guess you're over in Europe, huh? Thank you for that. Let the inbreeding begin. Yeah, look at Stephen. That is not a flattering portrait at all. So now, Stephen gives way to the descendants of Matilda. So Matilda marries Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou. Now, the Plantagenet dynasty was not known as the Plantagenets during their reign. That's kind of a later thing that we've put on them. I think it was probably contemporary to call them the Angevin kings, being descendants of Anjou. So, good afternoon, Jose. How you doing? Henry II, absolute legend. Yeah, it's hard to argue with that. So we are on now to Henry II. So Henry II, pretty solid, great soldier, great king. He extends his kingdom to where he ends up ruling most of France by the time that's done. Obviously, he makes some good marriages, things like that. Obviously, things fall apart in the next generation. Is there a bug-eyed king? I don't know. Yeah, Henry II, he's a possibility for S, but I tell you, what holds me back from S for Henry II is, number one, how things go between him and his sons, which obviously isn't completely in his control, but it made a mess of things for a while. So that's part of it. The whole thing with Thomas Becket is a nightmare too. So if you're not familiar with it, and there's a lot to this, Thomas Becket was a good friend of Henry II, and Henry II was having a lot of issues with the church. The church is completely autonomous at this time. Dane, thank you. He's having a lot of issues with the church, and basically what it is that the church is basically not subject to civil law. They have their own law, their own courts. And so Henry II tries to get around this by appointing one of his bros to be the Archbishop of Canterbury in Thomas Becket. But the issue is that Thomas Becket takes the job seriously, which Henry did not expect. He starts taking on the role of Archbishop of Canterbury and sees himself as separate from the king. And that becomes an issue. And as somebody already mentioned, Chris, at one point he hears about something that Thomas did, and he says, "Who will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" And a couple of knights take that to mean, let's rid him of this turbulent priest. And they go and they murder Thomas Becket, spread his brains all over the floor of the church. And This was a PR nightmare for Henry II, to the point where he had to go and just grovel to the English people, and he did all these things to show penance for what had happened to Thomas Becket, builds a shrine to him, and does all this stuff. Cameron, awesome, glad you're here with us. So for me, for those reasons, some of the messes that happened in Henry II's reign hold me back from being willing to give him an S, but I'm willing to give him a solid A for those things. So Skylar, thank you. I appreciate that. Vlog coin to the moon. Nice. Hey, thank you. I don't typically like it this short, but I got it cut short thinking that by the time I go to Georgia in 2 weeks to shoot some videos, it'll grow in a little bit. So oh boy, great Zeus. Yeah, we're not quite that far yet. All right, so we're on to Richard the Lionheart. I guess, so who's this here? Oh, that's probably Henry the Young King. So for a time, Henry's son kind of is like a co-king with him, but we're going to kind of skip him, I think. So, yeah, should have gone Anglican early, would have. I don't think Edward of Woodstock counts as a king, no. Where did I get this shirt? I don't remember. I've had it for years. It barely fits me anymore because I've put on a few pounds. But we're on to Richard the Lionheart. So I guess this is him here because that looks like John right there. So I think that's got to be Richard the Lionheart, right? Right there. So Richard the Lionheart only spent 6 months in England during his entire reign, which is 1189 to 1199. He's a great warrior, but he's not a good king for England. He really did nothing positive for England. He doesn't have an heir. He may have been homosexual. We don't know. Bisexual even. Doesn't have an heir. He practically bankrupts the kingdom because he not only goes on this crusade, but then he's on his way back and he gets captured and they have to pay an arm and a leg to get him ransomed. So really, honestly, as great as everybody remembers Richard the Lionheart as being, I don't think he was a good king at all. I'll keep him off of F, but I think he's going to have to be a D for me. So I'm just catching up with the chat now. Yeah, and he gets killed in battle. There's not many good portrayals of that in film. There's a decent one in the Robin Hood movie with Russell Crowe, where they showed the Richard the Lionheart attacking the castle. He gets shot kind of in the neck, right here at the base of his neck, by a crossbow bolt that a French cook fired. They end up skinning the cook alive after they take the castle. But greetings in Belgium. Awesome. Very cool. But Richard was friends with Robin Hood. Yes. All right. So we're on to John. So we go from bad to worse as far as kings go. John very nearly loses the kingdom for his dynasty. In fact, right at the end of his reign, John ends up almost being usurped by a French prince as king. So John's got to be an F, right? I mean, there's a reason there hasn't been a King John since then. Join to me talking about skinning a cook. Yes. Robin Hood existed for real. Certainly not in the way we think, but I'm sure that at some point there's somebody in reality that his character is based on. F is too high for John. Yeah, we need a layer below F. Loses the crown jewels, causes a civil war, loses London. Yeah, there's nothing really good to say about John. I mean, if you could say anything positive, it's that he was so bad as king that it brought about Magna Carta. Magna Carta is because John was a terrible, terrible king. So Louis was king, just uncrowned, but I don't think they have him in here because I believe that we are going, or is that Louis there? Because is this? No, this is Henry III right there. Because then this is Edward. I think this is Longshanks. That's Edward II. That's Edward III. Yeah. So, So this is John, which brings us to Henry III. Richard did forgive the guy that shot him and wanted nothing to happen to him. But after they took the castle, yeah, they flayed him alive. So save that layer for Cromwell. We're going to skip Cromwell since he wasn't really a monarch. All right, so we are on to Henry III. He's 9 years old. He's the son of John. He becomes king at 9 years old. Long reign for him, 1216 all the way to 1272. One of the longest reigns in history for the British Empire, for England. Again, rebellions are happening during this time. He did some good things. He was raised by priests, and so he's devoted to the church. He's all about art and learning, but he's pretty weak, and he gets dominated by counselors, unfortunately, influenced by the French quite a bit. So, excuse me. Our Eli Gaming, you're an hour away from Chattanooga in North Georgia. You should join us. I'm going to be there. If you join our Discord, I've actually got a channel where I've posted some stuff. And if you shoot me a private message, I've actually created a private channel on our Discord server for the folks that are planning on connecting with me, either in Chattanooga or in Chickamauga, or over in Toccoa or down at Andersonville in my trip that I'm taking in 2 weeks. Yeah, so Civil Wars. Henry III does some good things, on the side of the arts and things like that. I think he does some good things. He's got that big rebellion with Simon de Montfort. I'm gonna go ahead and put Henry III as our first C. Yeah, and it seems like other people tend to agree with me on that one. Yeah, mediocre. I think he's kind of the epitome of mediocre. So it seems like a lot of people agree with that as well. All right, so now we are on to Edward I, Longshanks, as he is known, the Hammer of the Scots, the Conqueror of Wales. So this one's going to be interesting. I am very curious to hear you guys' thoughts on this one. Edward I really makes his mark first while his father is still king. He gets captured, and he manages to escape and help bail his father out more than once. I think Edward is going to be S or A for me, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this. He forms the model parliament in 1295 that brings kind of everybody together. He obviously conquers Wales. He has the stuff going on with Scotland. He's a pretty solid king for England. Why is he called Longshanks? I think it's his hair, but he was also pretty tall, especially for that time period. Seems like we're pretty torn between S and A, but that's not him. What am I doing here? I'm gonna go S for Edward I. I think you can argue that he conquers Wales. He subdues Scotland for a while. He was very tall. Shanks are legs. Okay, so yeah. So it's because he was tall. And they had actually exhumed him at some point and measured him, and I think he came out at like over 6 feet tall. So I hear screaming going on, but I think it's my son playing Rocket League, so I don't think it's anything to worry about. All right, 6'4". Okay, yeah, so 6'4" is like a giant. In the 1200s, he was really tall. He did make a huge trebuchet. I think it was called War Wolf. And they actually, in the movie with Chris Pine about Robert the Bruce on Netflix, they show them firing War Wolf. And he did fire it one time at the castle in Scotland just to kind of show it off. So now we're on to Edward II. Certainly one of England's weakest kings. Outlaw King, that's the movie. Thank you, Take This Eye. So Edward II's got to be an F, right? I mean, yeah, these next ones are going to be interesting. So Tommy, you think C or D? I mean, Edward II gets deposed by his wife and her lover. He loses Scotland. Yeah, it's tough to argue anything other than F in my mind for Edward II, especially following up. If you look at the king that came before him and the king that came after him, how great they both were, at least in my mind. Boy, yeah, Edward II's got to be an F. You think F's too harsh? Some people are saying D. But man, when I think F, Edward II for me is one of the first people you throw up there. But under F, some people said. But yeah, he lost a lot. Man, G, somebody said. There's really not a lot you need to say about that. He's deposed by his wife. He loses Scotland at the Battle of Bannockburn. He gets murdered either by, some people say it was a red hot poker through his anus, but I think that's probably a later account that was pointing to his homosexuality rather than anything that's based in reality. Edward III is one of my favorite kings. I'm a descendant of Edward III. So he reigns for 50 years. Now, there's some really good things about Edward III. Obviously, the 100 Years' War breaks out during his time. He's got a pretty solid claim on the Kingdom of France. And we've talked some about the 100 Years' War already on this channel. I would be tempted to say S, and I still may. The only thing that holds me back from a clear S for Edward III has to do with what happens after him. I don't know how much of that is his fault, though. The whole kind of dividing. On the surface, it seemed like a good idea, making royal dukes, having a bunch of sons. But I think a lot of that was probably out of control. So these are things that were consequences of his reign. But I don't know that I blame them on Edward specifically. I think I'm going to go ahead and make Edward III an S. Yeah, the chivalry thing. I mean, to this day, you can see the impact of Edward III, the Knights of the Garter, for example. The fact that we have royal dukes at all, that's Edward III that's responsible for those things. Yeah, he can't be blamed for Richard II. Who knows what would have happened if his son, Edward the Black Prince, had lived and succeeded him. Man, England could have been a very, very different place. We probably never get the Wars of the Roses. So I'll go S. All right, we're under Richard II. Wow. Boy, I'm having a lot of F's here, but I feel like Richard's got to be another F, doesn't he? Why would Catherine de' Medici be in English Kings? No. I think the Black Prince probably would have been a good king. I think every ruler did wrong. Edward I had some things that didn't necessarily go well, but yeah, Richard II's got to be an F, right? I mean, he gets deposed by his cousin. He handles disagreements with his barons badly. Part of that is he comes to the throne so young, and he's got powerful uncles. But yeah, I mean, just he's an extravagant guy. He spends. He gets ruthless. He breaks his promises. He has the peasant revolt under Wat Tyler. Probably killed by starvation after he was deposed. And yeah, he is kind of the cause of the Wars of the Roses. Do their actions before their reign count? I would say only if they had an impact on the realm in some direct way. Yeah, there have been a lot of bad ones. Unlike the presidents, where I had a pretty typical kind of bell curve going on, we haven't had a lot of mediocre ones, but I think we're going to get to some. All right, we're on to Henry IV. Henry IV is going to be an interesting one. He usurps the throne from Richard II, his cousin. He's the son of John of Gaunt. So he's a grandson of Edward III. He returns from exile in France to take the kingdom. Parliament makes him king. Boy, this one's going to be interesting. I'm kind of leaning C on Henry IV. His reign was not a good one. I think most of the things he did that were decent were when he first took over. Who am I skipping? The only ones I've skipped have been the ones that were pre-1066. And then I think this is Henry the Young King, and I just chose not to include him. Yeah, I feel like Henry IV is kind of a mediocre. You could argue a D for him, probably, but I'll go C. Yeah. All right, so we're on to Henry V. So Henry V, um, it's tough to put him too high because of how short his reign is. He's only king for 9 years. He does great things while he's king. He basically defeats France, and pretty much it seems that you've got a victory in the 100 Years' War. A lot of people, I think, are going to be tempted to go S for Henry V, and I think had he reigned longer, it'd be a clear S. But I'm tough on this one. Yeah, this is where you start to get English being used in the English court instead of French. You start to really kind of anglicize England, so to speak. S tier so far, we've just got Edward I and Edward III. We've got William the Conqueror, and who was the other one that I put? Henry III, or Henry II as A's. Alex, we're not talking about that. We're try to keep focused, I think, on what we're doing. I'm gonna go. Yeah, I'll go A for Henry V. Using English in the courts is great, unless you're Welsh. That's fair. Yeah, it's tough because Henry V died young. It makes it difficult, I think. Balance out all the F's. All right. We are on to Henry VI. Oh, man. Henry VI. He becomes king when he's a baby because he's born, I think, like right about the time that his father dies. Strong issues with mental illness during his reign. Really had no business being king whatsoever. Can't drink with the cap on. That is correct. Yeah. I mean, Henry VI has got to be an F, right? I mean, I don't know how you'd make him anything but. Henry VI, we're just going to count it all as one. I'm not going to do multiple reigns. I mean, I see that they've got him in here twice. Kings of minority never go well. I mean, look at it. You're right. Some exceptions, right? I mean, Henry III wasn't horrible, and he became king in his minority. But, some of the other ones, not so much. Henry VI, you're right, was not prepared to be king. And yeah, the mental illness stuff's beyond his control. He's dominated by his wife. Obviously, the Wars of the Roses happen during his reign. Okay. Mad King Henry is F for sure. Okay, we are on to... Who's this here? I mean, this is Edward IV right here, so I'm not sure who this is supposed to be. And same here. I'm looking. Okay, so I guess that's. I think they may be out of order a little bit. I'm not sure, but this is Edward IV, so that's who we're going to next. Yeah, he would have been a good priest. I think you're right. So Edward IV, boy, this is going to be a tough one. Yes, the Wars of the Roses definitely inspired Game of Thrones. I have seen The White Queen. Takes some liberties with some things, but gets a lot of it right, too. So Edward IV conquers things for the House of York, becomes king, I think, at 18 years old, but makes some pretty big mistakes, most notably probably marrying Elizabeth Woodville, which did not do himself any favors, I think. I don't think it was a necessarily bad reign. Do Westeros Monarchs next. You could probably argue D. I might be inclined to go C for Edward IV. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on that. He did rely a lot on the Woodvilles. I think, again, his early death, he's in his 40s when he dies, creates chaos afterwards, but again, is that really under his control? I'm gonna go C for Edward IV. So then what we've got after Edward IV is Edward V. And this one's a pretty easy inconclusive. He's like 12 years old when he becomes king. He's never crowned. He's only king for a couple of months before he's deposed by his uncle. Why are kings so bad at picking spouses? Yeah. King Mari, I don't know the Swedish monarchs enough to be able to fairly rank them. So give me a second, guys. I have a message from my wife. She's at a baby shower. So... Okay. So, Richard II, then. I messed up Edward I and Henry III. How did I mess them up, George Washington? Richard III. Okay, so he's only king for 2 years. But you can't give him an inconclusive because obviously has a major impact on things. But I'm just not entirely sure that I can think of too much positive that Richard III does. He deposes his nephews. He basically opens the door for the Tudors to take over. So I'm catching up on the chat here. Henry VIII, Chad, S tier. Yes, I will include Elizabeth II. I will go all the way. Take this. You can't be a descendant of Richard III. I don't think he has any living descendants unless there's some illegitimate child that I'm not thinking of. Did I do that? Did I switch them by accident? Let me take a look at this real quick. Let me go back to... you said I have... Let me catch up with where that chat is. We'll get back to that in just a second here. He said I have Henry III in S and Edward I in C. Where is Henry III's picture? I'm looking at that here. So is this, yeah, is this Henry III here? No, that's Edward III right there. That's Longshanks, isn't it? Where's Edward III? This is Edward III right here. 95K? We should be at almost 96K. Let's check and see where we're at. 95,848. So you could be related to Richard III, but you can't be a descendant of Richard III. That's Henry III next to Edward III. I don't know. It was I went in the order that they were listed. So we'll just go with what I said rather than necessarily what it looks like. I'm gonna pull up my look at the Monarchs here real quick. I'm just looking at the portraits to see if I can try and figure out the portraits so I can get this right. Well, anyway, you know what I meant regardless of how it looks. Here we go. I've got the portraits I was looking for now. So this is Henry III right there. I'm looking at the portrait. That is a portrait of Henry III. All right, so that's done. Let's continue on. All right. Yeah, that's a definite portrait of Henry III right there. Okay, so we're on Richard the third. Yeah, Richard III might have been illegitimate, but that could have happened at any point in the line. It could have happened later on too. So, all right. So Richard III. I'm just gonna go F. He kind of blows everything up. and doesn't really do himself any favors with how he came to the throne in the first place. Opens the door for the Tudors. Let me pull my chat back up. Okay, we are on to Henry Tudor, Henry VII. And guys, right now, please do not ask me about doing other things, like other videos about other things. We are talking about this. I want to keep the chat focused on what we're talking about. So I'm just going to ignore, if you ask me to do German monarchs or ask me my opinion of a World War II general, I'm just going to ignore it right now. So be aware of that. Okay, so we're on to Henry Tudor. Now, Henry Tudor conquers England from Richard III, putting an end to the Plantagenet dynasty, starting the Tudor dynasty. Henry Tudor is very miserly when it comes to his spending. He obviously does a good thing for the kingdom by uniting the houses of Lancaster and York. He marries the daughter of Edward IV, so that pretty much puts an end to the Wars of the Roses. There are still some Plantagenet claimants out there that are going to be systematically dealt with during his reign and then during the reign of his son, Henry VIII. But Henry VII, boy, it's interesting. It's wild here. I got people saying A and people saying D for Henry VII, which to me says he's the epitome of a C, right? Well, John, I think you can probably understand why Henry VII thought that about people wanting to take the throne. I mean, think about how he came to the throne in the first place, and how there are kind of those Plantagenets out there still. You've got a son of the brother, or actually, it's basically a cousin to his wife that's still out there. There's claimants, there's people to worry about. I'm going to go C for Henry VII because, everybody's all over the map. We got people saying A, B, C, D. To me, that says good place to put a C. All right, this one's going to be interesting. Henry VIII. So Henry VIII is one of many examples in history where the second son, who is made the Duke of York, ends up becoming king. In fact, every single time going back for most of, I think it's probably always been the case. Every time the Duke of York has been created as a title for a second son of a monarch, that monarch that person has either become the monarch or died without children. So the dukedom of York has never been passed down from one generation to the next. Now that's about to change because Prince Andrew is the Duke of York. Well, no, because he's got only daughters. So I don't know how that works. So it's going to happen again. So Henry's the Duke of York. His older brother Arthur dies as a teenager. And of course, everybody knows the story with what happened with him marrying his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, for that alliance with Spain. This one's going to be controversial because, obviously you're tempted to rank him really high or really low because he's Henry VIII, and obviously he had a huge impact on England. But was it all positive? S for calves, Sheev Palpatine says. Yeah, a lot of people, contemporaries of Henry, talk about his calves and what great calves he had. He was actually considered to be a very handsome man in his younger years. It was only later in his life that he got fat and he came to look like what he did later on. Sutton Explorer, you grew up new. Is Nonsuch Park where Nonsuch Palace was? That was the palace that he built when he was married to Catherine Howard. As a king, C is a human being below F, right? And that's the thing. We, Phil Lee, I've seen that documentary. Yeah, character is one thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean a person's a bad king. S because he's one of the few that you've heard of. He was a handsome and fierce warrior, then got fat and lazy after coming to power. King Robert from Game of Thrones. Yeah, pretty much. All right. I got to decide. He's going to be a B for me. Feel pretty solid with B. Tremendous influence. He did a lot of good things. Not all of Henry VIII's reign was beheadings and marrying wives. There were some pretty solid things that happened during his reign too. he was just obsessed with this whole male heir thing, which is interesting because one of the greatest monarchs that England ever has is his daughter, of all people. He did demolish the monasteries, and that bothers me a lot. But he also gives England independence from the church in Rome, which I think is probably a good thing. He was one of many kings who bankrupted the country at different times. All right. Let's go ahead and... Okay, my son had to come in and tell me that he got his Xbox working because we were having trouble with it. Okay, we are on to... so now we're on to Edward VI, who is Henry's son. This, make like an Anne and Cleve. Wow. Christian, I'm sorry it took so long for you to get the notification. I'm not sure what that's about. All right, so Edward VI, I'm torn on how to go about him. I'm almost torn and want to say inconclusive, but he was king for 6 years, so it's hard to say inconclusive for Edward VI. But again, he's one of those guys that comes to the throne as a minority. He's only 9 years old. He had always been, Henry VIII finally gets his son that he's always wanted, and so he's really protective of him and kind of tucks him away somewhere, and that doesn't do him any favors. I don't want to put him at F, but I think you could probably say D for him. So who do we got here? This is going to be Lady Jane Grey. He tried to disinherit his sisters. Yes, that's true. So when it was clear that Edward VI was dying, probably tuberculosis, could have been something else. When it was clear he was dying, they get him to write a will, which bypasses his sisters Mary and Elizabeth, his half-sisters, in favor of his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, who is the granddaughter of Charles Brenden and Henry VIII's sister. So that doesn't go well. They put Jane on the throne briefly. She's obviously another one of those inconclusives because she's on the throne for like 9 days. She's never crowned or anything. It was contested. Some people don't even count her as one of the queens. So the two inconclusive right now are Edward V, who was the son of Edward IV, and then Lady Jane Grey. Yeah, poor girl. She initially gets deposed by Mary, but is imprisoned. But because people keep trying to overthrow Mary for Jane, finally they have to execute Jane. When you've got a strong claimant to the throne, or even someone who's an ex-monarch sitting around, that's a constant threat to your rule. And unfortunately, they have to be dealt with in that way. No, Robert the Bruised. No, we're only doing English monarchs and then British once they merge the crowns here in just a minute. Throne deposition speedrun record. Yeah, 9 days. All right, so we're on to Bloody Mary, and it looks like they've got Mary and Philip together in this picture. I'm not necessarily inclined to include Philip in this. Philip is the king of Spain, and he marries Mary. So some people argue that he's technically kind of a joint monarch. But boy, think about that. The king of Spain married to the queen of England. Imagine had they had a son, and what that might have meant. But Mary the First, boy, can anybody convince me why she shouldn't be an F? I can't think of anything good to say about her reign. Maybe somebody can give me a reason why. Somebody tell me why it shouldn't be an F. If she barely... Yeah, it's Philip II, yes. If she barely acted on her own accord, doesn't that make her an F for that reason alone? She scared you as a kid, Bloody Mary? Yeah. All right. Yeah, we're going to go F for Mary. Boy, there's a lot of Fs. Boy. Will, you make a fair point. You know, you can't complain about Mary killing Protestants when there were a bunch of monarchs that killed Catholics. You're right. She did a lot to improve Anglo-Spanish relations. Why didn't she have kids and they got Elizabeth? Or when she died, she didn't have kids. That's right. She had what was called a phantom pregnancy. She actually probably had ovarian cancer. And she was convinced she was pregnant, but she wasn't. She even had all the symptoms of being pregnant. All right, we're on to Elizabeth. Boy, I feel like Elizabeth's got to be an S, right? I mean, Elizabeth's one of the greats of all time. Why'd she kill so many people? Because her brother had been Protestant, and she wanted to bring, she's the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Mary the First is. She wants to bring Catholicism back to England. And so she basically does what you do to heretics as you see them, is to burn them at the stake. I mean, Elizabeth's got to be S, right? I can't think of any good reason not to be S for Elizabeth I. And it's amazing to me that if Henry had known that his daughter with Anne Boleyn would end up being one of the all-time greats in the history of the monarchy, boy, I wonder how he would have felt about that. An S for Cate Blanchett. Yes. Cate Blanchett. Yeah, if you haven't seen the 2 movies where she plays Elizabeth, they're fantastic. So that brings us now to James the First. Let me kind of skip ahead to get to my pictures here. That's not James there, is it? This is James here, right? Because this is Charles right there. So this is James the First. She did kill Mary, Queen of Scots. Well, technically, she signed off on it, right? Did she throw shoes at people? Maybe. James, I think, is a solid king. I'm kind of leaning A for James the First. So, first of all, let's talk about how James comes to the throne. Elizabeth dies, and that's the end of the Tudors. Because there's no more descendants known. I mean, there's no legitimate descendants of Henry VIII left at this point. So now you've got to go all the way back to the sister of Henry VIII, who was married to King James IV, who I'm descended from. I'm descended from James IV, but not through Mary Tudor. I'm descended through, or was it Margaret Tudor? It was Margaret. I'm descended through one of his many illegitimate children that he had. So through James IV, you get James V, you get Mary, Queen of Scots, you get James VI of Scotland, who is then a cousin of Queen Elizabeth. And so then when Queen Elizabeth dies, James of Scotland is the heir to the English throne, and that merges Scotland and England into a union of the crowns. They're not united as one nation, but they're both under the same monarch at that point. Have I seen the Horrible Histories Monarch song? I have. So James could be a B. I could be convinced of A for James. So boy, you want to talk about a dysfunctional family? There's some great books out there about the Stuarts, and I'm descended from the Stuarts, and I'm the first one to say that my ancestors were messed up. And we're going to talk a lot about them when I go to the UK, because I'm going to be spending some time in Scotland talking about the Stuarts, visiting some of the locations associated with them. And if you want to help with that, there's a link in the description to the GoFundMe, or you can sign up as a patron. The money from Patreon all goes to my travel fund for me to go create original content by traveling. Yeah, the Stuarts, boy, there's a lot of messed up. Almost every one of those Stuart kings for a while there dies kind of a tragic or unforeseen death. Deaths in battle, being murdered. And James IV was killed at the Battle of Flodden Field. James VI, his father, was murdered possibly on the order of his mother, which is kind of crazy. The Stuarts were nuts. Yeah, I would agree with that. Okay. I got to make a decision about James the First. So James the First, we're gonna go B. Good things. He's he does some good things as far as authorizing an English Bible, which was important, I think, for the kingdom. The King James Bible used to this day had some issues with the Puritans, things like that. Exploration is in full swing while he's king. In one word, how would you describe the Stuarts' ruling timeline? Chaos. Chaos. Okay, we are on to Charles the First. Yeah, the gunpowder plot takes place during James the First's reign, which is obviously a fascinating time in the history of England. Remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. So Charles the First, I have another connection here because one of my ancestors was one of the regicides who signed the death warrant of Charles the First and was one of the generals during the English Civil War under Cromwell. His name was Edward Whalley, Whalley. He actually came to America, hid in a cave for a while in New England when they started hunting down the regicides when the monarchy was restored under Charles II. But boy, Charles the First is an easy F, right? I mean, he's got to be F. Boy, we get a lot of Fs, I know. Cromwell's your ancestor? Very cool. We're going to skip Oliver and Richard Cromwell, who you have right here, just because they're not monarchs, though they were monarchs in everything but name. Hey, don't make no mistake about it. Oliver Cromwell was a monarch. He just didn't have the title. Who was king for 49 years? I mean, that's just a D based on length. Who are you talking about? Zachary. Who was king for 49 years that you're talking about? A lot of monarchies will have a lot of Fs. That's fair. Okay, well, I'm not going to place them in inconclusive because they're not monarchs to me. So I'm just not going to count them because they're not kings. So Charles II, here we go. This is an interesting one. This one I think is going to be one of these ones they're all over the map, I think. We're going to get a lot of different opinions from you guys on this one. So I'd be curious to hear what you think. He's known as the Merry Monarch. He restores the monarchy after the Cromwells. Dude had 13 mistresses, but he was popular with the people, but he was a weak king. Obviously, the Great Plague and the Great Fire of London take place during his reign, which are certainly bad things going against him. But of course, St. Paul's Cathedral and a lot of the rebuilding of London take place. There's a movie, I can't remember what it's called, but they actually show what's happening with the fire in London and how Charles II got involved in that late on. Yeah, I think C's probably a fair place to put him. We're not talking about anything besides the English monarchy, so please don't ask me thoughts on other topics right now. For being a player. All right, we're going to go C for Charles II. I think anytime you have opinions all over the map, it's a good indication that C is probably the safe place to go. Charles I is buried with Henry VIII in St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, which I cannot wait to go visit. Hopefully they open up US-UK travel. There's different vaults down there. And in one of the vaults, you've got Henry VIII, Jane Seymour, Charles I, and I believe an infant child of Queen Anne that are all buried in there. And they actually at one point opened the vault and opened the casket of Charles I, and they could see that his head had been sewed back on, and his eyes were open, and I guess the minute they opened it up, they disintegrated. I'm always fascinated by that kind of stuff. So where are we at? We're on James II, right? Gets deposed in the Glorious Revolution. Feel like he's got to be an F, right? Why do I have Royal High in my search bar? Because my daughter is a Royal High YouTuber that has like 170 some thousand subscribers. So that's why. I am not the only one in my family that uses this computer. All right, yeah, so we got to go. I almost put him a D for his awesome hair, but no, we're going to go. We're going to go there. Is this William and Mary right here? I guess it would have to be, right? So William and Mary come to the throne. James. So let's talk about James II for a second. He's the younger brother of Charles II, so he takes over. Even though Charles II had a bazillion kids through his mistresses, he had no legitimate heirs. We got another F coming, someone said. My favorite British dynasty would have to be the Plantagenets. It's my favorite time during all of that. So, you know, he has an illegitimate son of Charles II, the Duke of Monmouth, who rises against him. I think the Duke of Monmouth was executed at the Tower of London during all of that. Roxana, we'll get to Elizabeth II when we get to that time. Who are the best back-to-back monarchs? That's an interesting question. If they have good hair, they rank higher. All right, so William and Mary. William of Orange. He's actually Dutch, but he's William and Mary are first cousins. They're both grandchildren of who were they grandchildren of? They were grandchildren of Charles II, right? No, of I can't remember. But they're both they're cousins. They're first cousins, and so they are joint rulers. They're like co-king. You know, typically when you have a king, the queen is the consort. She's not really the queen, right? She's queen consort, so she's not a monarch in her own right. William and Mary. I don't know if I want to put them S, but I feel like they were pretty good. What do you guys think about William and Mary? So they come across in what's called the Glorious Revolution. So it's an overthrow of the king, but it's a bloodless overthrow of the king. Yeah, I feel like A, right? I mean, A is kind of where I was leaning with William and Mary, and since they've got them linked together here. Mary's the daughter of Charles I. Okay. I was thinking she was granddaughter of Charles I. I think they're grandchildren of Charles I. All right, so that takes us then to Queen Anne. So this is William by himself then, right? But we've already got William and Mary there in A. So we're on to Queen Anne now. Anne, boy, there's a lot of... I feel terrible for Anne. Anne has like 17 children, and none of them survived to adulthood. Just a really sad time. Yeah, I shouldn't say... I said relatively bloodless. It wasn't completely bloodless. The Glorious Revolution. Mary II is James II's daughter. Okay, that's it. So Anne, yeah, is she the first British monarch? Yeah, I believe the union of the crowns happens during Anne's reign. So maybe for that we'd give her some points. Matt, you make a fair point about does it make sense to rank monarchs after Victoria? No, we just use different criteria to rank them, I think. Yeah, the Act of Union is passed during her reign. That's pretty solid, but yeah, I feel terribly for Anne's story. It is a pretty sad story. The Glencoe Massacre, yeah, which I will also be covering when I go to the UK. I'm planning on visiting Glencoe and talking about that. Maraschino cherries, double S. So let me know your thoughts about Anne. I'm feeling B for Anne, but I'm not sure. Some people say S, some people saying C. Yeah, I think I'm going to go B. Because we're kind of all over the map. But I can't think of anything awful that Anne did to warrant being lower than a B. How much money do you make per 30K views on a reaction video? Not much, actually. I don't make anything on most reaction videos because the reaction videos, for the most part, especially the more popular ones like Oversimplified, get monetized for the content creator. So if you see me making an Oversimplified video, I'm not making a dime on that because all the ad revenue from my reaction goes to Oversimplified. I don't get any of that. Does Boudica count as a monarch? I don't know, but we're only doing 1066 anyway. Who's the best out of the S tier so far? I say Elizabeth. All the women are going to be top tier? Yeah, so far they are. Well, no, not really, because we've got Mary down here in F. Now the Georgians. Yeah, so here come the Hanoverian kings. So here's where it gets really nuts, and this is when the British royal family basically becomes German from here on out. When Anne dies, they've passed an act that bars Catholics from succeeding to the throne. And that's the case to this time, I think. They've loosened that somewhat. But they have to go all the way to Hanover, to the son of Sophia of Hanover, to get George I, Georg I. George I didn't speak a word of English and really didn't spend much time in England. He's the great-grandson of James I. He arrives in England at the age of 54, and he only knows a few words of English. He arrives with 18 cooks and 2 mistresses when he comes to England. He never did learn English, and this is when you get Robert Walpole becoming the first Prime Minister of England. So you have a significant transfer of governing power from the crown to a prime minister for the first time. So pretty interesting time in English history. I'm having a hard time seeing how George I is higher than C, and I'm rather inclined to make him a D. Of course, he deals with the Jacobite rebellion right after he takes over, and the Jacobites are the Catholic heirs to the throne who actually are much closer in line to the throne, but because they're Catholic, they've been bypassed. George is a D for not learning English. He was pretty lazy. Yeah, you could argue not real kings anymore, but I think we'll still do it, and we'll judge them on different criteria, really. So here's Georg I right here. I think I'm going to go D for George. So interesting story. Some of you heard me mention this. I was engaged once before I met my wife to my kind of junior high and high school sweetheart. From the time I was 13, I wanted to marry this girl. Her name was Lisa Walpole. And I can remember her brother was in my class. She was a year younger than me. Her brother was in my class, and we were good friends when we were little. And I remember when we talked about Robert Walpole. Hold on one second. I remember when we talked about Robert Walpole in history class, Lisa's brother saying that he was a descendant of Robert Walpole. And I thought, oh, come on, that's crazy. Just because you have the same last name doesn't make you his descendant. But then when I was engaged to Lisa and I started researching her family tree, sure enough, she is a direct descendant of Robert Walpole. My kids could have been direct descendants of the first Prime Minister of England, but she broke up with me and married someone else on our wedding day. So that's that. George II. The only son of George I, a little more English than his father, but still kind of relies on Robert Walpole to run the country. He's the last English king to lead an army into battle in 1743. Once again, he has a Jacobite rebellion in 1745. That's Bonnie Prince Charlie. When he lands in Scotland, that's where you get the Battle of Culloden, if you're familiar with Outlander. I think that's the story that's told there. So, yeah, dumped at the altar. Yeah, not quite. It wasn't quite like that. She broke up with me about a year before we would have gotten married. So it wasn't quite like that. But yeah, it did happen a year. But it worked out for me. I met my wife a couple years later, and all's well that ends well, right? So I appreciate all your kind words about that, guys. Things always do work out. I have no complaints. Obviously, at the time, it was brutal and heartbreaking and all of that, but we're cool. All is well. All right. So George the Second. Is this a C? I don't know. What do you guys think? I feel like this is a solid C here, but I'm willing to be convinced otherwise. Well, yeah, William III was Dutch, but George the First was German. I mean, either way, he was still a king in England. So, Jacked Up Truck 1991. Thank you for signing up as a member. I appreciate your support. I kind of feel like George the Second's a C. Yeah, he's kind of just meh, you know? I mean, nothing great, nothing bad, just kind of there, right? Because you're from Georgia? Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm going to go C for George the Second. Goosey, we're actually almost at 96. Let's see where we're at on subs. I'm going to refresh to get the latest number. 95,901 subscribers right now. So thank you guys. That is amazing. I never in a million years thought that would happen this fast. We'll probably hit 100K Monday or Tuesday. Why did I put Henry VIII in B tier again? We already talked about him. We're moving on now. All right, here we go. We're on to George III. Oh, yeah. When I think of George III, I can't help but think of Hamilton and the song, "You'll be back, soon you'll see, you'll remember you belong to me." If you haven't seen Hamilton and you're the least bit interested in musical theater, you have to check it out. It's fantastic. We saw it in theater a couple years ago, the tour when it came to Cleveland. It was so good. If you love history and love musical theater, you'll absolutely love it. So George the Third, I don't think he's as awful as a lot of people think he was. He did lose the colonies, but I'm not entirely sure anybody else would have done any better. I'm not sure anybody else wouldn't have lost the colonies. First English-speaking monarch since Queen Anne. There's some really great things that happened during his reign in England. Obviously, it's all overshadowed by his mental illness and by the loss of the colonies, but it's also during his reign that the British Empire outlaws the slave trade. And then eventually under his son William, they'll outlaw slavery itself in the British Empire. I think he's better than people realize. I'm kind of leaning towards C because he did take a pretty hard line with the colonies. But then again, how much of that was really up to him? And how much of that's really on Lord North and the folks in Parliament? I will send fully armed battalion to remind you of my love. So Brits are saying more like A or S. Napoleonic Wars. Yeah, I mean, he's basically checked out by the time of the Napoleonic Wars. Ah, boy. George the Third. The two in the inconclusive section are Edward the Fifth and Jane. What's her name? Queen Jane. I'm drawing a blank on her last name all of a sudden for some reason. George III. Oh, B. We're going to go B. I think he was better than people think. I think he was a decent king. Thank you for that. A compliment on my singing. Especially because we're about to get some more bad ones here coming up. Lady Jane Grey, thank you very much. I don't know why I was drawing a blank on her. George the Fourth. So, first of all, we didn't mention that George the Third's actually the grandson of George the Second, not the son. I think George the Third's father was Frederick. He dies before his son. That's why George the Third inherits the throne. So we're on to George the Fourth, so the first of two sons of George the Third. George IV was actually Prince Regent for a while during the later years of his father's reign. King George III was on the throne for 60 years, but he for the last decade or more, had pretty much lost his mind. It was some kind of a blood disease. I want to say it was called porphyria or something like that. George the Fourth. He was called the first gentleman of Europe. Great love for art and architecture and things like that, but boy, a mess in his life, right? He's married twice. He married a Catholic secretly first, and that was a no-no because you couldn't inherit the throne if you were married to a Catholic. I think they just changed that rule in England. But then he marries Caroline of Brunswick. This one's tough. He did hate his wife. You're right. Ah, boy. Let me know your thoughts about this one. We give him a D for Buckingham Palace. Yeah, he is the one that's responsible for turning a house into a palace, basically. Greedy, fat, and expensive. Never asleep. Thank you. Welcome to membership. I appreciate that. So 3/3 says D. What does everybody else say? I'm kind of leaning C/D. Some people say an F. Yeah, George IV is king from 1820 to 1830. We are almost at Victoria. He banned his wife from his coronation. Yeah. I think we'll go D for George IV. I think that's probably fair. William IV. He's king from 1830 to 1837. He gets married to try and keep the succession going. He had 2 daughters that both died young. He was kind of a very unpretentious guy. Didn't like all the pomp and circumstance of royalty. They passed the Reform Act during his reign, reign, I guess it is, which enfranchises the middle class property owners. They abolished slavery in 1833 during his reign. So there's some solid things happening during William IV's reign. He's a D only because the F's are so bad. William IV is, you can't really argue he outlawed slavery, but it happened during his reign. So there's some decent things you could say about William IV. What do you guys think? I'd be curious to know about William IV. I don't think he was bad. I'm kind of in that BC range for him. We're at 95,920. We're 80 subs away from 96,000. Pretty crazy. Best hairline S. I'm going to go C. I think we should have a lot of C's. My sons are going outside. Okay. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria is a granddaughter of George III. She comes to the throne because her 2 uncles, who were kings, died without legitimate heirs, and so the kingdom passes then to the daughter of the 4th son in that family, which is Victoria. She comes to I think her name was Alexandrina Victoria. She comes to the throne as a teenager. She's, I think, 18. Everybody's saying S for Queen Victoria, right? I'm not sure how you could argue anything else. She marries Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, who is her first cousin. So there's, here comes the hemophilia and kind of the inbreeding and everything. Empress of India, indeed. I'm a big fan of Victoria. So it's pretty cool that 2 of the 4 that we've got at the S tier right now are females. But F for marrying her first cousin. Arc Revolver, thank you. Appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about her. Some great things happening during her reign. This is really when England kind of goes the final way toward constitutional monarchy. Victoria is probably the first monarch that really has hardly any real power to speak of. But solid head of state for the British Empire, I think. Zombie guy, hello. She still had an uncle. Why did she not become king? Because that's not how the inheritance works. For example, the same thing's true with Elizabeth II. Elizabeth II, her father is king. When he dies, he still had a younger brother who was alive. But his younger brother doesn't become king. It passes down through his line if he has legitimate descendants. So had William IV, for example, had one of his daughters survived, they would have inherited the throne rather than Victoria. This is the height of the British Empire during Victoria's reign. It is primogeniture, that's right. So it passes to the next in line, male or female, whoever's the heir to that person. If that person has children, it passes to their children. If they have no children, it goes to the next sibling and their children. Hi from Michigan. I love your videos. Ohio sucks. I'll forgive you for that. I don't know how you can say anything else for Victoria. Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. It's a German family. That's where Albert is from. The British monarchy is very, very German at this point. From George I on, it's basically a German family for the most part. So she's, again, on the throne for 64 years. Longest reigning monarch until the current queen. Victoria is the end of the Hanover dynasty. Starting with her son, it's the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which we know today as the House of Windsor, because they changed the name during the reign of George V, but we'll get to that. Jack the Ripper is during her time, and some people have tried to argue that her grandson was Jack the Ripper. There's no evidence of that, and he's got an alibi for some of the murders. But here again is a situation where you have a potential heir to the throne who dies before becoming Prince of Wales and later king. So her eldest son is Edward VII. Her eldest daughter, I think her name was Victoria, marries into the Hohenzollern family. Queen Victoria's eldest grandchild was Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. So this is Queen Victoria is known as the grandmother of Europe because basically every royal family in Europe is descended from Queen Victoria. They're all also descended pretty much, for the most part, from Christian IX of Denmark. Those two are pretty much ancestors of all the royal families in Europe. I will do UK prime ministers at some point. Dark Pit, greetings in Wales, one of my favorite countries. Victoria was not related directly to Nicholas II. I believe Nicholas's wife was a grandchild of Victoria. No, I don't think Nicholas II was a grandson. Nicholas II and George V were first cousins through their mothers. But I don't think Nicholas II was related to Victoria. I think his wife was. Somebody can correct me on that and look that up if they want to. So Victoria, to me, clear S. Now we're on to Edward VII, who is her eldest son. He's a pretty popular king. Cool story about Edward VII, by the way. He had a mistress named Alice Keppel. Alice Keppel is the great-grandmother of Camilla, the wife of Prince Charles. So Prince Charles had an affair with the great-granddaughter of the woman that his great-grandfather had an affair with. Or great-great-grandfather, which is kind of crazy. The House of Hanover have any male line descendants? They might. I'm not sure. That's a good question. Snick Kitty, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, Edward VII was a ladies' man. So Edward VII had an older brother, Albert, the Duke of Clarence, named after their father, or his Edward VII's father, Albert, Queen Victoria's husband. Duke of Clarence dies. He was kind of a ladies' man too. Slept around, got sick from disease, and died. So then Edward VII is another one of those Dukes of York who inherits the throne as the second son. So they call this the Edwardian Age. Edward VII is an interesting king. He marries his brother's betrothed. He marries Princess Mary of Teck, who was supposed to marry Albert. Interesting, I'm reading here, when Edward died in 1910, it was said that Queen Alexandra brought his current mistress, Mrs. Keppel, to his bedside to make her farewell, which is kind of fascinating. Edward VII, yeah, I feel like this is going to be a C, right? Bertie was solid, didn't get much time, but has done well with what he had. I feel like Edward VII is probably a C. It's midnight there, Gunther. Okay, we're on to George V. George V is the guy that, in pictures, looks like the twin of Tsar Nicholas II. They were first cousins through their mothers. And yeah, you can see they switched uniforms in the picture. They were wearing each other's uniforms, which is pretty crazy. Ernest August von Hanover is actually holding the title of Prince of Great Britain and Ireland today. So yeah, he's probably a direct male line descendant. Because yeah, when Victoria inherited the throne of England, a cousin of hers took the throne of Hanover because that had to be through a direct male line. Women could not inherit the throne of Hanover. George V should have sorted it out with his cousins. Yeah, I'm very disappointed that they didn't give asylum to the Romanovs. That does tend to make me kind of put him down a little bit. Also, I hate how it was a sign of the times, so I don't want to blame George V too much for what happens with his son John, who had epilepsy, I think it was, and was basically hidden away from view until he died. The House of Windsor, no, they're the line of, well, it's Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. When Prince Charles takes the throne, he's a direct male line descendant of Christian IX of Denmark. Her uncle took the Hanover throne. Okay, that's it. Yeah, technically it should be a new dynasty. It should be Mountbatten, I guess you could argue. Or Battenberg, the House of Battenberg. But we're on George V. Let me know your thoughts about George V. Thank you, Josh. See how close we are to 96,000 here. A decent king but terrible father. That's a fair way to put it. 95,930. All right. I got to make a decision about George V. He's another one of those guys that isn't supposed to be king, right? Yeah, so he's the one who... Yeah, I was confusing him and Edward VII. It's George V, whose brother was Albert, the Duke of Clarence. So I got that all kind of thrown off, and somebody mentioned that already. It's George V who marries his brother's fiance. I'm going to give him a B. Edward VIII. I feel like this is going to be another inconclusive, but at the same time, unlike the other inconclusives, Edward VIII had it within his power to stay on the throne. Okay? It wasn't like Edward V and Lady Jane Grey, who both were deposed by relatives before they really had a chance to do anything. Edward VIII, this was by his own making. He's very popular. Yeah, he's... Enns makes a great point. Edward VIII is pretty pro-Nazi Germany. So I'm going to give Edward VIII, I'm going to put him on F. He made his bed and he lied in it. So that's all on him. Yeah, I feel like that's got to be an F. House of Oldenburg. Yeah, I mean, I guess the House of Oldenburg, it will, but no, it's not going to. They're going to stay Windsor. I believe the house name is going to stay Windsor when Queen Elizabeth dies. But that's never going to happen because she's going to live forever. So abdication plus Nazi equals F. That's fair. He was popular, but being popular doesn't make you a good king. Edward VII was popular. Doesn't make he was a good king. So, yeah, I got really very little good to say about Edward VII or Edward VIII. George VI is one of my favorite monarchs, one of my favorite historical figures of all time. I have such incredible respect for that man. He was a good man. I think he was a good king. Overcame a debilitating stammer at a time when being able to speak was pretty much the most important thing you could do as a monarch. The thing he had to be the best at was completely out of his control. Bertie, yeah, I'm a huge fan of George VI. What he overcame and how he did it just blows me away. I highly recommend you guys check out The King's Speech. What a great movie. I know it's not all 100% historically accurate, but I think Colin Firth gave one of the all-time great acting performances as George VI. I'm also a really big fan of how, oh gosh, what's the name of the guy who played him in The Crown? He's the son of a famous actor. And his name's drawing a blank on me right now. Somebody help me out, and it'll take a few seconds for this to catch up with you guys in the chat. But his dad was a famous actor. He played him in The Crown. Somebody help me out. Sherry, thank you. Jared Harris, thank you. I love Jared Harris. He's one of my favorite actors. And though he didn't necessarily look, neither did Colin Firth, look like George VI, I loved his portrayal of George VI in The Crown. He is Moriarty in the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes movies. So, man, I'm a big fan of George VI. Had no expectation he was going to inherit the throne, except for the fact that his brother abdicated. George stopped. He did. You're right. George stopped Churchill from going to Normandy by saying he would go too. Refused to leave London during the Blitz. Some people argue he was killed by his brother's abdication because he, basically put himself into an early grave. He is also in Chernobyl. You're right. If you could meet one historical figure, it would be George VI. I'm right up there too. I don't know if he'd be first on my list, but he'd be right up there. If you can't already tell from my gushing praise of the man, I love George VI. I love everything about the man. Have such admiration for him. I'm going to put him S because he's the king during World War II. One of the most critical hours in the history of the British monarchy. He's debilitated by this stammer in a time when he's got to be able to speak to reassure the public, and he overcomes that. And of course, he's the father of Elizabeth II. And unlike his father, George VI was also a good father. I think he was a good king and he was a good man. And that's rare to see that. In all these people you see on this list, there aren't many who can both say they're good people and good monarchs. No, George VI wasn't in Chernobyl, but the actor who plays George VI in The Crown is also in Chernobyl. S for Lilibet. And so there's a quote. Before we get to this, George V was quoted as saying that his son Edward would basically be, give up the throne within a year. And he said, I pray God that nothing comes between Bertie and Lilibet and the crown. He called his granddaughter Elizabeth Lilibet. And he was right. See, George V even recognized that Bertie was the one who really had what it took to be king. And you know what? Honestly, I'm going to go S for Elizabeth II as well. I admire the woman. Perfect? No. certainly has fumbled over some things, but look at what has happened during her lifetime. Look how the monarchy has changed. Look how the world has changed. Look at everything that has gone down. And by and large, I think she's handled it pretty well. But being immortal, yeah. You know, I'm not saying she's perfect. None of these people are. But boy, you know, I mean, and look at this. 3 of the 6 are women. So kudos on them. Yeah, decolonization. I didn't put Edward VIII in inconclusive because he gave up the throne. So George V we put in B. Putting Queen Elizabeth II in S adds another 100 years to her lifespan. So cool story. The church that we go to is like 50 minutes away, so it takes us a while to get there. There's a town we drive through called Lisbon, Ohio on the way. And in Lisbon, there's a house that has an American flag and a Union Jack flying in front of the house. Every day when we drive to and from church, I say, God save the Queen as we go past it. And my kids joke that I just added another 2 months to her life every time I say that. So she's basically immortal. Predictions for Charles. I think Charles is going to be solid. I know not everybody's going to agree with that, but I actually like Charles. I think he's a good guy. I think he's going to be a nice bridge between Elizabeth and William. It'll be interesting to see if he takes the name Charles. I think if he had come to the throne 20 years ago, it might have been more likely that he was George VII. But I think as long as people have known him as Prince Charles now, he's, you know, in his early 70s, I think he'll probably just go with Charles III. But yeah, I could see him going to be George VII as well. But I like him. Now, he's not going to pass it on to William. He will take the throne. He's going to be like Edward VII. He's going to be one of those like 10-year guys or something. The Queen's mother lived quite long. The Queen's aunt also lived over 100 years, I think. You know, and honestly, I'm not a huge fan of Diana. I think Charles didn't treat her very well, but I think Diana also did a lot of things to hurt herself. But I love William. I think William's great. I think he's going to be one of those. He could end up being one of those S-tier types. He seems to do everything right. I think Charles will be solid, but not outstanding. But, you know, it's hard to say. Yeah, and I agree. Other than how Charles treated Diana for the most part, you know, pretty good. But I'm going to wrap it up right there. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be watching this after the fact, so let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you guys, everyone who joined us for this stream. I hope you enjoyed it. I appreciate everyone's input. Thank you to those of you who joined as supporters through membership or Patreon. We are at 95,940 on subscribers. I'm going to try to live stream as we get close to 100K, if possible. If not, I'll do a live stream as soon as possible after we hit 100,000. We're going to be doing some big giveaways for that, so I'm excited. All right, I'm out, guys. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.